In this video, we'll be looking at an extremely fast aperture wide-angle lens, the Sirui 16mm f1.2. Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this video I'll be offering you my thoughts on the Sirui 16mm f1.2 sniper lens for APS-C systems. Now it's a moderate wide-angle lens with a super fast maximum aperture and autofocus at a fairly budget price. Now Sirui reached out and asked if I would like to test either their 16 or 75mm lens, and I immediately knew that I wanted to try the 16mm. Now I'm a sucker for a faster aperture wide-angle lens. There's just something kind of special about being able to use extremely shallow depth of field with a wide field of view that I just love. So I wanted to see if this was a lens that I would add to my kit. Now, of course, the usual disclaimer applies here before we begin looking at the lens. Sirui did send this over for testing, and I do get to keep the lens. Now, the only thing that I was asked to do was to sign an agreement with them, basically to the effect that I wouldn't spread false information and would post my video by a certain date. Now, unfortunately, that does mean that I haven't had quite as much time as I would like with the lens before filming this review. But as usual, Sirui don't get to see this video before it goes live, and they don't have any input on the content at all. What they have done, though, is provided a code for you guys, so if you would like to purchase one of these through their website, you can get a small discount from them as well. Now, I'll leave that link below and the code on screen here. But enough of that though, let's chat about the lens. The lens feels well built and solid in the hand, and given that it has this extremely fast aperture and it's also quite large, I was honestly expecting it to be a lot heavier than it is, but it's surprisingly light at just 386 grams in the X mount. Now, it has no weather sealing and no aperture ring, both of which are a little bit disappointing, but I guess they're to be expected when you're dealing with an autofocus fast aperture lens at a budget price. There are always going to be a few trade-offs to hit that price point. Now, the barrel of the lens is a very quirky design that combines several different materials, textures and colors. Now, it seems to be completely made from composite materials that feel really nice in the hand, but don't mesh together as well as I might hope. The area closest to the mount is a smooth black section with an interesting lip that dips down to a sort of a bare carbon weave section, and that embosses back up to another smooth black section, and that joins the knurled focus ring, and from there we get to the anodized blue ring that we see on all of the sniper lenses, and finally a grey section right at the top of the lens. Now, in the middle of all that, we have these little cutouts in the lacquer that house the Sirui logo and also the AF and APS-C badges, and finally there's this engraved section here for the focal length and the maximum aperture. Now, overall, it's an extremely complicated design that definitely is best suited to Fujifilm's modern style bodies. And personally, I love a much simpler design, but that's just a personal thing. So let me know what you think about it in the comments below. Now, the included rear lens cap is yet another different style of cap that doesn't hold very well onto Fujifilm's own lenses, and it's better just to be replaced with a first-party Fujifilm one if you have multiple lenses in your bag. It also doesn't completely cover up the USB port on the mount, so you'll want to be careful to make sure that you don't get dust in there as well. Now, also, I've found that this front cap tends to pop off almost every time I put the lens in my bag, so I've just taken to replacing that with one of my Fujifilm ones and leaving this one at home as well. And finally, there is the lens hood. Now, it fits well and it holds tight, but in the beginning I did find that it was so tight that the lens was actually scraping off small layers of the plastic from the hood until it started to fit well. Autofocus on this lens is a bit of a mixed bag. Being a stepping motor, it's fairly rapid and absolutely silent, and when it does its job right, it's a great experience. One thing that I have noticed though is that it does tend to pulse a little bit before acquiring focus, no matter what sort of light you're using the lens in. Now, a lot of these things I'm sure are to do with the firmware of the lens, and Sirui will be able to make changes in some upcoming firmware releases, but we'll see what happens with those. Now, with that being said, it's been very accurate once it gets where it needs to be, and the images are always in focus, so that's definitely good to see. And also, as you can see here from this quick AFC test where both myself and the passers-by were walking towards each other, each and every frame is in focus, and tracking works quite well, so if you need that in your work, this lens shouldn't disappoint. Wide open, the center of the frame is quite soft and improves slightly as it's stopped down to f1.4 and f2 and then f2.8. Now, it's not until f4 that it gets very good, and then f5.6 and f8 are the sharpest apertures for this lens. But even then though, it maintains a slightly lower contrast vintage feeling to the sharpness. It's not tack sharp and high contrast like a lot of modern lens designs. The corners follow the same trend. From f1.2 to f2.8, they're extremely soft and the edges of objects take on a bit of a glow. From f4 they improve quite a bit, and then f5.6 and f8 are the sharpest apertures again in the corners of the frame. If we compare the center of the frame here with the equally priced XF 16mm f2.8, you can see that the XF lens is sharper in the center, wide open, than the Sirui lens is when stopped down to f8. Now, at equivalent apertures though, the Sirui does produce slightly better corners than the XF lens, which relies really heavily on software tricks to keep the design of the lens so small. For my use, which is entirely still photography, I prefer a lens that produces slightly sharper and more contrasty images right out of the box. It gives me a good starting point for where I want to go, but I also work with some of Fujifilm's best lenses day in, day out, so I would like to hear from you guys in the comments about how you feel about the level of sharpness from this lens by the end of the video. Do the images coming from the lens have enough detail to sort of satisfy your needs personally? Green and purple, or red and blue fringing, seem to be very well controlled by this lens design, and I haven't noticed them in any of my shots, except for a couple of stray examples around the bokeh balls and in extremely high contrast edges like streetlights at night. But even then though, they haven't been something that drew my attention in the images, and that's really great to see from a fast aperture wide-angle lens. With an ultra-fast wide-angle lens, we're definitely going to need to talk about the quality of the bokeh. Now, overall, this lens does a really good job with the bokeh rendering, and as we expect from a wide-angle lens, it can get a little bit jittery at times, but it's mostly quite pleasing and doesn't really draw your attention away from the in-focus areas. Wide open, this lens produces around a 3-stop vignette in the far corners, and that fades uniformly towards the center. This gradually improves towards f5.6, where it's almost completely gone, and then it comes back again at f8, and then at f11 and f16, oddly, it improves again. Sunstars are definitely possible with this lens, but I haven't found them to be particularly well defined, and they do tend to come with a little bit of flare and ghosting when creating them with the sun. Now, at night, I didn't notice any being formed by streetlights in any of my images, but that's likely to be because I wasn't close enough with a lens this wide to actually see them form with those small lights. Flare is quite well controlled with this lens, and I've really only noticed a reduction in contrast in really extreme situations like this one, where the sun is shining directly down the barrel of the lens, and here you can see a slight softening of the shadows. What does show up in situations like this though is ghosting. Now, most of the time it's not too extreme, and this is really the strongest ghosting that you're going to see from this lens. If you do like the effect though, it appears at all aperture values to varying degrees, and if you're not a fan, small changes in composition will allow you to send the ghosting out of the frame, or place it somewhere in your composition where it can be easily cloned out later. A couple of types of photography where a fast, wide-angle lens like this could be good are night cityscapes and astrophotography. Now, unfortunately, coma and astigmatism are quite significant with this lens, and they really only clear up by f4, and that really does make it quite a hard sell for these sorts of work if you're planning to use wider apertures, unfortunately. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I really love the look that comes from working with a fast aperture wide-angle lens. Now, I really loved the Viltrox 13mm f1.4 and the Samyang 12mm f2 for this exact reason. Both of those lenses, just like this one, have their pitfalls, but as with this lens, they offer some really interesting possibilities, especially when working in close. Now, speaking of working in close, this lens has a minimum focus distance of 30 centimeters, which is much further away than both of Fujifilm's XF 16mm lenses. So there's no getting in super close with this one, unfortunately, but it does allow for some interesting possibilities even at that working distance with its super fast aperture. The lens feels really nice on the camera, and it feels like it will last, but unfortunately, especially given the type of work that it's likely to be used for by a lot of people, it isn't weather sealed in any way. Now, I was really enjoying making some images of the ocean while this storm raged away on Jeju Island, but as I got closer to the ocean, I could feel the sea spray starting to hit me, and just as those first drops of rain started to fall, I put this lens right back in my bag and switched to my XF 18mm f1.4. Aside from the peace of mind that I got from using that weather-sealed lens, I immediately noticed two other things. Now, the first was how much sharper and more contrasty the XF lens was. The other thing was just how reliable the autofocus feels to use. Now, the Sirui lens, as I said in the autofocus section, does a good job of getting things in focus. However, With no rhyme or reason occasionally, it will just pulse back and forth before acquiring focus, and this happens in soft light, in hard light, during the day, and at night. It doesn't happen all the time, but it seems to happen randomly, and I really hope that this is something that Sirui can improve in an upcoming firmware update. These are the main negatives that I've noticed while testing this lens, but it has been a lot of fun getting back out and using a wide-angle lens for a change. Now, throughout my busy season, I've been pretty much locked into 23mm, 33mm, and 56mm for most of my client work, which tends to be portraiture. And it was a bit of a shock to the system to put a 16mm lens on, start walking around the city and try to compose images again. It took a moment just to be able to find compositions with this focal length, and I've really been enjoying taking it out into the tight alleyways of Seoul and just expanding them into sort of wider compositions. There's very little, if any, barrel distortion that I can see from this lens, so keeping lines straight is easy if you can keep the camera level. Now, it's also been great for some oceanscapes as well, but as I mentioned, I was constantly worried about getting the lens wet. Now, especially at the mount, I would really love to see some weather sealing, because if it gets water on it, you're not only putting this relatively cheap lens at risk, but the very, very expensive camera that it's attached to at risk as well. And so this basically meant that I was always going to be extra careful and not fully committed to the photography of the day. This is the first lens that I've used from Sirui, and it's been an interesting experience. Now, it's not the sharpest lens that I've used, but it's also not the softest. And the center of the frame is quite good and then gets significantly better as you stop down. The corners start out really mushy, and then they get significantly sharper as you stop the lens down as well. Now, it has some quite good coatings to resist flare and ghosting, which really don't show up at all except in extreme situations. And fringing is also really well controlled. Now, it also produces quite nice bokeh, but that is a little bit rougher than the bokeh you'll get from something like the XF 16mm f1.4 or the XF 18mm f1.4, and both of those lenses will also focus a little bit closer than this one, allowing you to get super shallow depth of field and really make use of that nice bokeh. Autofocus could also use some significant improvement, and hopefully that will be possible in upcoming firmware. Now, on to the obvious competition. This lens has an asking price of $399, which puts it in exactly the same price bracket as the XF 16mm f2.8. But of course less than half the price of the excellent 16mm f1.4. So let's quickly compare this to the Fujifilm lens that has the same price tag. Now, the XF 16mm f2.8 is weather sealed, it's tiny, it's light, it has a sharper central area but slightly softer corners than this lens. It has a lot going for it, and if you're going to be stopping the lenses down heavily anyway, that would be my choice for its portability and its weather resistant build. Now, if you're looking to use this lens wide open, there are a couple of things that you need to be aware of. The center of the frame is reasonably sharp and it gets better as you stop down, but the corners very much are not until you get to f4 or f5.6. Now, if those things are important to you, then the XF 16mm f1.4, the XF 18mm 1.4 will both be better options, but they're also both going to require you to open your wallet significantly wider than with this lens. So with all those things being said, let's ask a few questions. Is this a good lens? Yes. Is it a great lens? To that I'd probably say no, but can it make great images? Absolutely. It's down to the photographer, not the lens, to make great images. It's all about how you see the world and how you use your equipment. So, is this lens for you? Well, spend a little time considering what you prioritize in terms of cost, image quality, autofocus, size, weight, and you'll be able to figure out if this is the right wide-angle lens for you. But as always, I hope this review has been helpful to you, and do let me know if you have any questions about this lens in the comments below. For now, enjoy the slideshow, and I'll see you in the next video.